In 1968, the revolutionary director George Romero revolutionized the horror genre by making Night of the Living Dead, the first zombie movie ever made. Zombies have then since become a household name, and while they would never refer to that in his movies, he is the godfather of all zombies. Countless TV shows and movies have been inspired by this man's work, including some of my favorites of all time. You can argue whether the impact of zombies into our pop culture was good or not, but you can't deny that it has made an impact. And I was never a person who liked zombie movies until I saw his original 3 movies. Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead are some of the greatest movies I've ever seen. Some of my favorite horror movies of all time. I cannot express to you how much I love each of these films. They bring me so much joy because of how creative and beautiful they each are. So I'm going to go through and review each movie in the entire trilogy, and at the end, I'll rank them and give some of my closing thoughts. So let's move on to the first movie, Night of the Living Dead. Now, this is a movie that I can admire because it's what started the whole thing. But it's probably the worst out of the trilogy. And this movie is aggressively 60s. It has that cheesy music, the classic weird acting, but the effects aren't too bad because the black and white kind of hides some of it. This movie was also pretty revolutionary because it was one of the first movies to ever have a black lead. So that's something else you can admire this movie for. This movie basically had no budget, and it did the best that it could with the budget that it had. And throughout this whole trilogy, I get a vibe of people just kind of improvising stuff on the spot, and people just having a good time when they're making a movie. This entire trilogy is the opposite of a corporate product. This movie doesn't really hold up to today's standards, but I would have been amazed if I saw this in 1968. And it's probably the best movie of 1968. I mean, what other movie came out that year? This is one of those movies that I can admire and a movie that I actually enjoy watching. This movie is actually very entertaining, and I would recommend it to people who just want to have a good time. Also, George Romero didn't really have an explanation for why the dead are coming back to life, so he was just like, I don't know, it's an asteroid or something. Sure, it's a cheesy monster movie, but it's something everyone can enjoy. It knows what it is, and it's not trying to be anything more than that. And for that reason, it gets an 80% toothpaste meter. If you haven't heard of Dawn of the Dead, you've heard of Dawn of the Dead. It's the one where they're in the shopping mall and they have to fight off all the zombies. It's a very 70s movie, just like how Night of the Living Dead was a very 60s movie. Would you like to know the incredible true story of how George Romero came up with the idea for this movie? He was in a shopping mall and he thought to himself, this would be a good place for a zombie apocalypse movie. And so he made the movie. This movie probably has the worst effects out of the trilogy because, in Night of the Living Dead, it was all black and white, so you couldn't really tell. And then Day of the Dead, that movie has amazing effects. This is probably the most uplifting out of the trilogy. Night of the Living Dead, everyone dies. And Day of the Dead, everyone's just crazy. The color is probably the best part of this movie. The blood doesn't look like real blood. It's very colorful. Everything has a very neon look to it. It's a very vibrant movie. The characters are really fleshed out and the acting is really good. And there are some really emotional scenes, which I wasn't really expecting from a zombie movie. The best part of this movie is just seeing how they barricade and secure this mall to make it safe and livable. And all the character interactions and just their day-to-day life in this zombie apocalypse. It feels like how the real world would react if this was happening. You know how I said that Night of the Living Dead is like a good time and that you can watch it? This movie is a blast. You will have so much fun watching this movie. The only problem I really have with this movie is that you can't find it anywhere. I had to get it from my local video store, which is extremely outdated. There's a little bit of commentary on consumerism, and now we're all kind of zombies walking through a mall, just slaves to the corporate machine. Some nice commentary, don't mind it. This is up there with The Thing as being one of the coolest movies I've ever seen. It's really awesome. Out of the entire trilogy, this has the most improvisational type feel. They made up a lot of the kills on the spot. This is probably the most accessible out of the entire trilogy. It's something that everyone can watch, and it has a pretty basic plot. This movie is a spectacle movie. It's not something you should ponder after you watch it, but it's not forgettable in the slightest. It's something that I will continue to watch, and for that reason, it gets a 90% toothpaste meter. Now, I'm actually a little upset why people don't talk about this one, because this is my favorite of the trilogy. You know how Night of the Living Dead represented the 60s and how Dawn of the Dead represented the 70s? Day of the Dead represents the 80s, but in kind of a different way. In the 80s, the Cold War was at its peak, and America and the Soviet Union were extremely paranoid of each other. In Day of the Dead, the soldiers are extremely trigger-happy and very paranoid of what the zombies are gonna do. And this one, out of the entire trilogy, shows that there's a very thin line between zombies and humans. This idea is showcased in Bub and how he's more sympathetic than most of the humans. This movie has the best gore effects, not just of the trilogy, but some that I've ever seen. For a budget of only $3.5 million, it's amazing the stuff they were able to accomplish with it. Throughout this whole movie, you get a sense of despair in that the war is practically over and the zombies have won. It's 400,000 zombies to one person. All these people are trapped in a bunker and they have no idea what to do. They have no plan, no hope of salvation. And whoa, holy crap, the acting in this movie is probably the best out of the entire trilogy. Bub deserved the Oscar. There's not that much I can say about this movie without spoiling it, and I definitely don't want to ruin this movie for you. This movie is easy to find, and you can rent it on Amazon Prime. This is easily my favorite of the trilogy, and for that reason, it gets 100% toothpaste meter. In conclusion, I think the Dead trilogy is one of my favorite trilogies ever made. It's up there with Indiana Jones, Star Wars, and the Cornetto trilogy. All of these movies are endlessly entertaining, and I will be rewatching them consistently. As for ranking the trilogy, I would say Day of the Dead is the best, followed by Dawn of the Dead, and then Night of the Living Dead is the worst. And remember, when there's no more room in hell,
the dead will walk here.